Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our fifth 2023 Giller Book Club. My name is Daphne Rabinovich, and I will be your host for this night and the remaining 8 book clubs. Please make sure to have your Zoom on a side-by-side view for the best possible experience. And it is my profound pleasure tonight to introduce you to our interviewer, Michael Crummey. Michael is the author of 12 books of fiction and poetry, 12. His most recent novel, The Innocents, was shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, the Governor General's Award, and the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize. Passengers, a collection of poetry, was published in 2022, and Michael lives in St. John's, Newfoundland, and still doesn't look a day over 22, speaking of 22s. Tonight, Michael will be interviewing André, author of the 2022 long-listed and beautifully composed novel, In the City of Pigs. Please feel free to submit all of your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and please join me in welcoming Michael and André.
Thank you very much, Daphne. And I'm thrilled to be here with André this evening, to have been invited to be part of this, and to have had the chance to spend so much time in the last little while with André's novel, In the City of Pigs. This is André's first novel, came out last year with Dundurn. He's also the editor of After Realism, 24 Stories for the 21st Century, which also came out last year with Vehicule. He's a journalist and a literary critic. And I'm thrilled to be talking to him.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to interview me, Michael. It's a huge pleasure.
Well, it's as I said, I just really loved spending time with this book over the last month or so. And before we get into the actual interview, I thought I would, just for people who are with us who haven't read the book yet, that maybe I would give just a very quick overview of the book that would help with some of what we'll be discussing later on, I hope. So In the City of Pigs is the story, and is narrated by a young man named Alexander Akazov, who's a classical pianist who's just given up his performance career after suffering a mental health crisis on his first solo concert tour. And he's abandoning Montreal, where he's lived and studied for years, and is moving to Toronto, where he plans to reinvent himself as a music journalist. And in the course of that act of reinvention, Alexander ends up rubbing shoulders, and in fact, sometimes rubbing a lot more than just his shoulders, with just about every strata of Toronto society, from the vast underclass of servers and renters that the city seems designed more and more to push out, to the movers and shakers in the avant-garde and the more traditional classical musical world, and also to the moneyed philanthropists and the financial speculators and the property developers who are standing behind and pulling the strings of the whole enterprise. It's a terrific book. It's beautifully written. It's subtle and it's complex and compelling. And unlike a lot of standard Canadian literary fare, and I include my own books in that sweeping generalization, In the City of Pigs it's a novel of ideas. And through the course of the book, we watch Alexander and the people around him struggle with the idea of art and its place in the world, with the relationship between art and audience, and with the seemingly intractable problem of artists' relationship to the ruling class, to money, and to what the book calls the endless sucking pull of power. So I'm hoping that we get to talk about some of that this evening. And as Daphne mentioned, if you're watching and you have questions we don't get to, you can put them in the Q&A and we'll hopefully get to some of them. But first off, André, of course, I'm not used to being on this side of these kinds of discussions. So is there anything I messed up there, or anything you want to add to that?
No, you did a great job. I guess I would say, I don't think he moved to Toronto to become a journalist. I think he moved to Toronto thinking he was going to make a lot of money doing something. And then, of course, he's not able to do anything really, because he has no idea how to make money, and so he just sort of ends up falling back into this world that he knows, that he's trying to get out of but can't.
Right. And it's, yeah, and part of what he wants to escape, it seems like, is the kind of endemic poverty of the artist's life as well. And he has this dream that Toronto is a place where that can happen for him, where he can be one of those people who falls into money somehow.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, I think anyone familiar with the Canadian, I don't know if geography is the right word, maybe psychogeography. Montreal does sort of inhabit this place in our mythology of being the place that's bohemian, the big city that's bohemian and that's a little down at heel and a bit louche, but it kind of creates these artists. And Toronto, I think, has a reputation for destroying everything it touches and just kind of turning everything into money. I think it's obviously more complicated than that, but I was trying to play around with that idea that Toronto symbolizes something very different from what Montreal symbolizes for a lot of Canadians.
Well, we had talked about you reading a little bit from the book off the top, just to give us a sense of the flavor of the book. So did you want to do something for us?
Yeah, I'm going to read from the beginning of the second section. So Michael thank you for doing such a wonderful job, kind of briefly encapsulating what the book's about. It's told in 4 sections that are each kind of distinct. So this is the beginning of the second section, which is called The Lower Registers. I arrived in the city on a Tuesday afternoon under low clouds. I walked out of the train station, and the statues in the park, the homeless people shuffling beneath the trees, the gray faces of the pedestrians seemed to belong to another time. My hotel was on top of a hill, across from the Citadel, but I followed the station road twisting down to Bishop's Wharf. I'd seen the water from the window of the train as we came in along the port, gray like the weather. Everything on the waterfront was new and clean, but the water itself. I smoked a cigarette and threw the butt into the filthy scrim licking the wooden piles. The smell of salt and kelp and dead things clung to the pier. I was completely alone. On the far shore, the holding tanks and cooling towers of the derelict refinery lay flat against the horizon, the pilot flame of the flare stack extinguished. In between, the sleek back of a small island rising from the water. But it was the harbor I was interested in. For years, it had been the place where Europeans stepped out of their histories to become happy provincial Canadians. And now below its surface, a machine was being built, the first in this country, the largest in the world, yet there was no evidence of it at all. It started to rain. I pulled my jacket closer and walked up the hill. My shoes kept slipping on the slick stones of the street. The lobby of the hotel I was staying in was sepulchral, and a long, washed-out man stood behind the front desk. Pushing his glasses up his nose, he asked if he could help me, although he didn't look like he wanted to. I told him my name, and he consulted his computer screen and began flipping through a small box looking for a plastic key card. Business, he said, and I realized he was asking why I had come. I suppose. You suppose? I'm writing a piece about the organ, I said. Oh, that. He gave me a look. What a typically stupid idea. This city is always coming up with these stupid ideas because of the money, or rather the lack of money, I guess. They keep thinking one of these big projects is going to bring in a bunch of business for the city. It never occurs to them to invest in something that might provide folks with a steady job. There's always some handout for a professor, some halfwit with a plan that will really put Halifax on the map. You heard about the refinery, yeah? Turning it into a terminal for cruise ships. Say it'll boost the local economy, bring in those American dollars. He stared wetly over his glasses and paused, rooting his tongue along the root of his molars. Tell me something. If you were here on a 5-star cruise liner in from Boston, would you stay at my hotel? I tried to look sympathetic. He hadn't handed over my key card yet. Perhaps with the organ it will be different, I said. The proprietor nodded. There was a twitch around his left eye that made it look like he was winking. Listen, I'm United Church myself, so it's not like I'm against organs as such. Used to love listening to my grand play the old one they had up at St. Matthew's. Beautiful sound, especially with those old hymns. Holy, holy, holy. Oh, God, our help in ages past. I get all choked up just thinking about it. They took it out because the minister decided he was going to play everything on his guitar. It saved him paying my grand, you see. No sense for the tradition. I'm telling you this so you know what you might call sympathetic to organ music generally. What I don't understand is if they were going to build the biggest organ in the world, why did they decide to put it at the bottom of the harbor?
Thanks, Andre. Part of the reason I was interested in you reading from that section is kind of a side trip in the novel because it takes place in Halifax. And Alexander's been sent by the magazine he's working for to do a story on this thing called a hydroorganon.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about what a hydroorganon is and where the idea for it comes from?
Sure. Yeah, so in 2017, early 2017, I was living in Toronto, and a really good friend of mine named Joel Peters, who's a composer and an organist who lives in Montreal, called me up one day and he said, I've started this collaborative arts group with another organist, and we want some literary tie-in with the music we're doing. And we want you to write a short story about an underwater organ. And I sort of thought, okay, well, why not? I was writing a novel at the time. I'd been writing this novel for years, and it was just atrocious. It was a terrible, terrible journeyman's kind of book. Like, I was learning how to write a novel by writing this novel. And I was at the tail end of the project, and I was just realizing that this wasn't going anywhere. So I was kind of looking for something new to try, and this idea just came to me from my friend. So that night I started writing, and within about 2 or 3 nights, I'd written the entire story. So that I never work like that. It's about 8,000, 9,000 words, and so that's a lot for me to write that quickly, and it hasn't changed all that much. So there was obviously something going on with this idea and with this collaboration that really worked. So I gave him the story, and I think he was asking. I think he had in mind like a Kafkaesque short little 3-page story about underwater organs, and I give him this, this fake academic study of them. So they built a concert around it that premiered in 2018 in Montreal, and it was very well attended for a classical music new composition. And people came to the concert and came up to me afterwards and said that they were surprised they hadn't heard about this underwater organ being built in the Halifax harbor, which was really the best compliment a writer can get, right? That I pulled it off. I made this impossible, ridiculous project seem real enough that at least some people thought that it could be real.
Yeah. I knew there wasn't one in Halifax, but I kept thinking, is there one somewhere else? Like, this can't be real, but you made me think it could be.
Yeah, I was working as a journalist at the time, and I'd done a lot of nonfiction writing, and I was very interested in the idea that the way we talk about something influences how we understand like what kind of a thing it is, what kind of writing it is. So if you start reading a news story, you know it's a news story because it says something like, on April 25th, the government minister made an announcement, right? So immediately the style of the writing is telling you what you're dealing with. So I wanted to play around with introducing some of those nonfiction tools into the fiction. And so the idea of calling it a hydroorganon, was itself kind of can I come up with some sort of pseudoscientific word that will make this sound like it's a real phenomenon, rather than just calling it an underwater organ. So,
well, so this was a one-off thing. It was for this particular concert by your friends. What made you think that there was a novel to be written around this piece? This is the second in a 4-movement novel. When did you think, oh, there's more here that I can do with this character?
Yeah, well, after the success I mean, success in relative terms for a classical music concert, this was fairly successful. They asked me to do another one. So I did another story, and this with the same journalist character. And this one was about a guy who's trying to create some sort of totally mad music hall. And so we published that one. We did a concert around that. And by that point, I had about, I had these two big chunks, and I had spent enough time with this narrator character that I kind of knew who he was. So then I went back and thought, maybe I can turn this into something like a novel. So at that point, I then kind of thought, okay, how does he end up in Toronto? How does he end up doing this job? He clearly was a musician at one point, but now he's not. So how did that happen? And that kicked off thinking of it as a full project as opposed to a series of discrete pieces. And the composer of Space story didn't make it in. It was cut right at the end of the process because I just felt that piece no longer fit into the novel. So extracted it. Yeah.
You said it was interesting. You said you could turn it into something like a novel, because it's the way that it's structured is really interesting to me. Like, I mean, there is a through line that you follow in this book, but the through line is often ideas, and the structure of it is, in my understanding anyway, a musical structure, and that the 4 sections are like movements in a musical piece. When did that notion come to you, and what kind of challenges did that present to you in trying to create a story?
Yeah, I don't know when it exactly came to me. I think I was thinking a lot about structure in works of art, about structure in political life, just what this idea of structure does for us and does for a piece of art, in part because the 20th century in literature, in painting, in music, in the West at least, was very much a time of pushing structures to their limit. And then in the second half of the century, this idea of deconstructing, right, of taking structures apart and seeing inside them. And in some ways, that was a very successful movement. You got things like, James Joyce at the beginning of the century. But by the post-war period, you've got people making poems that are it's just typographic, right? It's the letter X, and that's the whole poem is X repeated in interesting shapes. So it felt like, well, okay, once someone's done that, where is there to go? And I feel that not just my generation, but the generation maybe previous to mine, the kind of inheritors of that deconstructive approach. So I was thinking about what are some other ways of structuring a thing that are fresh, that will allow something maybe new to happen. And this borrowing, I mean, I strongly believe that most creativity is not someone sitting alone and coming up with something totally new. It's someone borrowing creatively from somewhere else. So I thought, it's a book about music. How is a symphony structured? Can I borrow from the structure of a symphony and write a novel with that in mind? So a symphony, there's an opening movement and that introduces certain themes, and those themes are then played with throughout the symphony, and then you get usually a kind of final movement that ties it all together. And over the course of the 19th century, that explodes. Mahler's got like 7 movements, 8 movements in his symphonies. But that four-part structure is kind of the core of the symphony. And all of the movements typically will have very different moods. So I wanted to play around with that. So the first opening section, I feel, has a kind of a different mood from the second section. So once I had that idea in my head, it first of all allowed me a way of understanding how disparate pieces can be put together into a whole through this idea of motifs, right? An idea that appears in all 4 parts. And then it also just provided a way to make sense of the fact that I had these pieces, right? I was trying to knit them together.
Right, and it's like each piece in a way is structured around Alexander's relationship to a woman who's also a musician. And relationship is overstating it in some cases, like in the second movement is just an interview that a process of interviewing a woman who's building this hydro organon. But in each one of them, that it feels to me like they turn on that relationship with a particular woman. And like, was that something that you had going in, or was that something that just happened as you were writing, or did you have those things in place in your head, or were those things you discovered as you went?
No, I didn't. A lot of this stuff I didn't have in my head. Um, and again, the fact that it ended up being for women, it was completely an accident of the fact that two sections got cut. You know, those sections had the men in them, and they were weaker sections, right? So for whatever reason, it turned out to be these these four women.
So I'm sorry, this is a bad pun, but so the men were the weaker sections.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Um, Less interesting, at least.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to belabor it if too much anyway, but I mean, music is really the heart of the book, and there's so much of the book is writing about music. It's describing particular pieces of music or describing performances of music. And it's, I think, the best writing in the book all the way through. And it didn't matter whether it was writing about a very famous composer and a very famous piece, or if it was writing about what I assume was a completely fictional um, piece of music. And I just wanted to ask you about writing about music. Like, is that something you've done a lot of? What are you thinking about when you're trying to use words to present what music is and how it works on the page?
Yeah, it's a very good question because I'm actually not sure if I know the answer. I certainly didn't do a lot of music journalism or anything like that, but I grew up in a very musical household. A lot of my friends in university were musicians, so I kind of was always around people who were speaking in a very musical language and were talking about music in a certain way. So I think I internalized a lot of that, and I had a lot of that available as language that I felt comfortable with. And it, I don't know, it was a, I love music in part because words are closely tied to meaning, right? You can't have a sentence that, you can have a sentence that doesn't mean anything, but books tend to be written in sentences that mean something, and they tend to be about things.
Right.
And what I love about music is that it's sound, and so there's almost something that it feels like it's appealing to an older part of the brain, a part of the brain that's kind of pre-linguistic, and uh, I'm interested in that challenge, and I'm interested in how music is made to hold meaning and to create meaning. And I'm also interested in, again, just crossing that artistic boundary between one form that is very verbal and one form that is very nonverbal, and how that.
I think it's Margaret, right? One of the women, the woman in the fourth section, she says something like, "Music for her is an attempt to communicate something that existed before we had words for it." And it seems to me that music is uh, it has that ability to, and there are moments in this book where you see that happening, where you see people responding to music in that way, in a way that is almost impossible to describe, and yet you manage to do it really, really well, I think.
That's very kind of you to say. I'm there were moments where I wasn't sure I was pulling it off.
Yeah, well, I mean, I certainly never had a moment where I thought, he doesn't know what he's talking about here, or I'm not feeling what he's going for. So, but I was interested in the relationship between the different arts, between music and literature and visual arts to a lesser extent, which is also discussed some. But I mean, the whole book in a way is about what is art and what does it do for us? Like, why do we have it? And also talking very openly often about how useless it is sometimes, you know. I think they're discussing Prokofiev, his life, and how he retreated into irony, and that, how does it they put it? talking about the uselessness of art in a time of political upheaval and that sort of thing. So I guess I really just wanted to, it's all through the book, and it constantly forced me to ask myself that question. And I thought, since I have the chance, I would ask you that question. Like, what is art to you? Why do we have it, and what does it do for us?
Yeah, I mean, it's the question.
You have 30 seconds.
Well, I totally unscientifically, I think about it as existing on, there's like three modes that we're talking about when we talk about art. And I think one of them is a very pure and very beautiful mode, which is just, this is something that humans do. We make sounds, we tell stories, we draw pictures, you know, tens and tens of thousands of years of human history. We have evidence that humans are doing these sorts of things. A couple of weeks ago, my wife and I were in Buxton, which is a city, or it's a town not far from here. We're staying in a hotel, and it's one of these old Victorian kind of faded glory type of hotels. And they had a grand piano in the lobby. We got back late at night, and there was an old guy, can't have been younger than 80, sitting at the piano, and he's playing like a pop song. And the bar is full of these younger people who know this song and they're singing it, you know. And there's this moment of all of these people who have this thing that they share, this song that they know. And yeah, it's just something, that's what we do. That's what we do as humans. And we use very different musical scales, we use very different musical languages, but that thing of it being something that draws people together, I think, is very real. And if I don't know, I'm sure that there's some sort of evolutionary psychology reason for that. I don't think about that too much, but I think that there's something there. And I think that's, you know, you see little kids, they're coming up with stories, they're making up stories. It's part of how they're understanding their place in the world and what the world is.
Right.
That's something really important. Then you also get art as an economy where people are trying to make money. And you get art as a reputational economy where we have this idea of Shakespeare as being the great English poet, you know? And that's where things get a bit dicier, because it's
Right.
the same thing, but it's different.
Yeah. I mean, now Alexander, through the course of the book, I mean, when we meet him, he's kind of, and he mentions it several times, completely disillusioned, and in a way is freed by his disillusionment, right? He's been given permission not to care. Can you talk about that in relationship to art and his way through that? I found that really interesting, and I wanted to hear your perspective on. Does that question make sense, first of all?
Yeah, I think it does.
Okay.
I think it's a really important question for him. What does it mean to fail? And I think it's about what I was just saying about what is art for, what does it do? And I think he was very fixated on art as a reputation, art as being the best at something. And when he encounters his old rival in the third part of the book, like, that's a lot of what's coming up, is this feeling that she was better than him. And so he's already gone through the process of grieving, in the sense that he's realized he's not going to be the best. But he still doesn't quite know what to do with the fact that he likes music and that music is in his life. And he's constantly saying these really snide things about music. He's like very critical. And I think it's a defensive thing. Like, this is the only way he knows how to talk about this anymore, because he's spent so much of his life competing. And in the fourth section, there is a scene where he sits down at a piano again. It's been a long time now since he's played, and it's not a performance. He's using music to reach out to another person in a way. And there was an important scene, I think, in his development of maybe him starting to realize that there's something else there that he can rediscover.
Right. That's where he's playing for Margaret, right? Who's singing at the cottage in Prince Edward County, and it's one of the few performances in the book that is a private moment. And he had heard her sing for the first time at a tiny bar, and it's described as everybody feeling like the space was sanctified by the way she sang there. And I felt like there was something really important about that moment where they performed together, but for nobody else but them. And I guess there's a lot of talk in the novel about the relationship between art and its audience, or lack of audience. The woman who's building the hydro organon, right?
Yeah.
At one point, she says that the hydro organon will begin its true work on the day that no one will pay to listen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I guess this is related to the whole notion of the difference between art as reputation or art as something other than just being itself. And I felt like that moment between Margaret and Alexander was transformative for him in a way, because it was just for them in that moment. Is that fair?
I think so. Yeah. And
And
that, I mean,
what
there's all sorts
difference?
of, oh, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I was just wondering, how much does an audience pervert? And does it necessarily pervert what art is or how it operates?
Yeah. I mean, part of the way of writing the book the way I did is that I didn't have to come down on anyone's side in these sorts of questions, right? Because I appreciate the idea that there is something very special about art that exists without an audience. There's a really good short story by Borges called "A Private Miracle" or "A Secret Miracle," I think. And the whole idea is this poet is he's working on this epic poem, gets arrested, gets on the wrong side of the regime. He's put in prison. He's taken out to be shot, and as he's waiting to be shot, he prays and he says, "God, just please let me finish my masterpiece before I die." And time stops, and he realizes that God has allowed him to finish his masterpiece, but only in his head. Like no one will see this. No one will know it except for God, as it were. And I love that idea. I love the idea that there is art that exists outside of the audience relationship.
Right,
But I also love the idea that art is one of the ways we reach other people.
right. Yeah, yeah. I guess it's the whole question of does the art if the art falls in the forest and there's no one to hear it or see it, is it art? Which, yeah, and I guess I do agree with you that the book never comes down on one side or the other, which is one of the things that was uh, frustrating and beautiful about the book. I think was that whenever I wanted it to say something definitive, it constantly uh, did a U-turn somewhere and refused to let me settle where I wanted to settle as well, which is a feat. I wanted to talk about Toronto.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, this is in some ways a book about Toronto. It's a Toronto novel. And I loved how it was talked about in the book, and I made some notes. Of course, Toronto was Hogtown, so the city of pigs. Um, uh, it's described as, in its bones, still a provincial city. It's described as a village where you have to watch what you say because it'll get around. It's described as a dream of concrete and glass and steel hanging above the solid earth, a city caught between revolution and reaction, a city that only recently began to wake from its pious slumbers, the Methodist Rome, a real fucking bummer, and a good place to be a lawyer, which I thought was an interesting comment on the place. Can you talk about your relationship to Toronto? Are you from Toronto originally?
well, I was born in Toronto in the late '80s, and it's a good reminder that of the eternal return, because my parents were sort of unable to stay in the city because rents got too high back then. As they moved to a small town, but I had family there, so we'd always go down to Toronto. And um, when I graduated from my master's degree, I decided to move there and finally kind of make a go of it. And I love Toronto, and I love Toronto in the way that, I mean, maybe you have this feeling with your home. Like there is something in the love that's also hate, right? This deep frustration, this deep sense that, oh my God, this place could be better than it is. Why does it keep being this way? And I left Toronto last year because my wife got a job in England, and so I she's a professor, so that's the deal, right? I moved, and I was happy to move with her, and I'm reasonably happy in England, but I miss Toronto. But I also, when I when I got the plane ticket, I got my visa, there was an element of relief. There was an element of finally I don't have to engage in this struggle to love this place that is never going to love me back. That's so hard to live, and the rents and like all of this stuff. Like it felt like it was making me a bit crazy. And for the reasons that I talk about in the book, like this feeling that Toronto doesn't quite know what it is. And it's not a backwater anymore. It's not an unimportant city. In 2016, I was in St. Louis, Missouri, and I was in a hotel, and the guy who was kind of operating the elevator asked me where I was from, and I said, I'm from Toronto. And he said, oh, that's a great city, which I was not expecting. I was not expecting someone in St. Louis to think, oh, Toronto, that's a good place to be. But by that point, Drake, The Weeknd, the music of Toronto had built its reputation in other parts of the world. And I've gotten that reaction in a lot of places I've gone, that there is a sense of Toronto as being, it's not New York, but it's a,
Right.
yeah, it's a real place. So it has achieved that, but there is also, I think, a large number of people in Toronto who sort of resent the fact that it's not a provincial city anymore and kind of like it to stay small and manageable.
Right, right. I mean, there's also a relationship between a place and the artist it creates or doesn't create, as the case may be. And early on in the book, Alexander talks about the way Toronto is now compared to how it was 30, 40, 50 years ago, and says that the Toronto of today could never have produced a Glenn Gould. And it seemed a fairly provocative statement. And I wasn't sure it was something that you would buy into, but I wonder if you could talk about that. Like the Toronto of today is producing The Weeknd and Drake and Julie Black and all these other people, and there's great writing coming out of there. Can you talk about the relationship between how a place works, how a city works, and the kind of art it produces?
Yeah, I don't know if I can generalize too much. I think his comment about Gould, it's a sort of multi-layered joke, because of course Gould was a famous weirdo and was just a deeply strange man who himself said the only places he ever felt comfortable were Toronto and St. Petersburg. In the Soviet Union. Like so he's a very odd man, and I do think there's a sense in which the Toronto he grew up in couldn't produce someone like him. But I'm not sure that that's a bad thing.
Right.
And I think the Alexander thing is being a bit of a shithead.
Yeah.
I do think that, like, I went to university for my undergraduate degree in Winnipeg, and Winnipeg at that time, maybe 600,000, 700,000 people, but it's very far from anywhere else. So you get all of like the weird kids, like almost 1,000-kilometer radius, like end up in Winnipeg. And that breeds a very interesting artistic community, because there's a lot of people with interesting ideas, but there's very little money. And there's very little sense that there's a kind of economic ladder that you can get onto with art. And I think it's different in Toronto. There is more of a sense that there's a market, that, there was a certain number of young people in Toronto who really are gunning for a kind of career in a way that smaller cities, there just isn't that kind of career.
Right.
There's...
Yeah. And I mean, that plays a huge role in the way the book unfolds, right? There is this developer, Sean, who is kind of the Mephistopheles, or maybe just the devil, straight out in the book, who is kind of pulling the strings behind. Even the most anarchic avant-garde artists are having their strings pulled by this guy to like force out small grocery stores and stuff like that so they can buy up property and put in more condos. Can you talk about, like, that's Toronto right now, is it? Is that how things work there, would you say?
I don't know if I'm qualified to say.
Now, you wrote a book, so you have to say. I'm sorry.
I think that I'm sometimes frustrated by the kind of blanket idea we have in the Anglophone West, at least, that artists tend to be dissident revolutionaries. Sometimes they are, legitimately. Sometimes they are, but often they're trying to make money, and artists for a very long time have made money off of rich people, and that's kind of the symbiotic relationship, is that you want to get some of that money, because then you can do this for your job, right? You don't have to have a full-time job. I've always had a full-time job. I've always written in evenings and weekends, like almost every writer in Canada. Um,
Yeah.
and that of course you want to be able to do this for free, but that does mean that you're playing that game, and the trade-offs inherent in that are not talked about enough.
Well, I wanted to follow up on that because, I mean, I think it's Susanna who says all in the book, all artists are mendicants, all artists are beggars, and that there's and the sense that we have some kind of symbiotic relationship with the ruling class or with money, and that we can't live without it, and we have to find it somewhere. I mean, there are some interesting things that happen in the book when art and capitalism, art and capital come together, and not necessarily good things. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that, actually, how you see artists' relationship to money. Is it possible for artists to operate within the world of capital without being hopelessly compromised somehow?
I mean, I'm very conflicted about these questions. I think that it is. I think it takes a great deal of courage, and I think it's not much of a career. And there are people who have, who've been very brave about drawing, hard lines about who they'll work with and who they won't, in terms of funders and publishers and all that kind of stuff. It's part of why I chose classical music, because with writing, it's a little bit different, because the only technology you need is a computer at this point, and you can spread, so there's a lower barrier to entry, and there's more ways to kind of work around the system a bit. But with classical music, you need a lot of people, and you need a hall, and you just need infrastructure in order to be able to make that kind of art, which is why one of the reasons I chose to write about classical music as opposed to other forms that are maybe less capital intensive.
Right.
Because it felt like it really intensified that question.
Yeah. I guess I'm also just thinking in terms of, that whole notion that for almost all writers in Canada, they have to have a job, and there's the desire to be free of that and to write full time is huge, and even the temptation to try to write something because you think it will sell, as opposed to writing something because that's what you want to write. I think that's something that everybody struggles with on some level, and what does that do to us when we sit down at a computer, for example? And and I think it's something that you have to fight against, really, personally, that to give in to that, I think, is the end of your life as a writer, or the beginning of the end. But I don't know.
I think I would love to know what kind of algorithm there is to telling what kind of writing is going to make them money. I think that there was a time when I thought like that I thought, oh, if I only wrote this kind of thing, then I would sell big. And I just don't, I have friends who write other types of literature, thrillers and more popular forms. And I resist, on some level, I kind of resist the idea that that's not art. I think that these are legitimate genres, but I also know that there's not that much money in it. And I think it's kind of a crapshoot, whatever you want to write.
Right.
And in the world of literary fiction, I think we have this idea that, well, if we were writing novels with dragons in them, then we'd all be George R. R. Martin, we'd be rich HBO shows. And I think there's a lot of people writing books about dragons who aren't making a lot of money.
Yeah. I know I don't want to give the wrong impression here. I know that we're past 7:40, and then I have to remind people about the Q&A if they want to submit questions. So if you have questions you want us to get to, we will try to get to them in a second. I don't want to give the impression that I feel like there's a hierarchy of writing, that somehow if you want to write thrillers, you're less of a writer. I just think that there's, if I could sell out, I would in a second. Like if I knew how to do it, if that was in me, I would do it. But it's not in me. Like I'm writing the books that are in me, and that's all I have. And I think that those are the books that we're meant to write, and those are the only things we have a hope of being successful with.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I don't like, I don't think there's anything wrong with having a day job. And I think I relish the financial stability. Like I'm just not comfortable not knowing where my rent is coming from. And there was a time when I was much more conflicted, and now I'm just kind of, yeah, I do this for a living, and I do this, and it's kind of my hobby. And I got longlisted for this prize, which I was not expecting in any way. That was huge, but it felt like a gift. It felt like not something I relied on. Like if I didn't get this, then I was really screwed. It felt like, this is really nice, and it means that I'll probably get published again.
Right.
Rather than sometimes rely on that, because I think if you rely on it for your livelihood, then those pressures become a lot stronger.
Right.
You have to be selling a certain number of copies.
Right. We are coming up to the point where there are a couple of questions from the audience that I want to get to. But before we do that, I know that you were asked if you had any book recommendations for people.
Oh, yes. Well, I'll try to be brief about this so we have time for questions. But so the books that I would like to recommend are, first of all, Orhan Pamuk's Nights of Plague. Orhan Pamuk, I mean, he doesn't need me recommending him. He won the Nobel. But this book is fabulous. It's kind of a murder mystery and also a history of this kind of fictional island. And it's very much about kind of Mediterranean politics, fall of the Ottoman Empire. And I think he's a great writer. And I think this book is a real kind of tour de force from him. And it's about a pandemic. So, that's relatable.
Right.
Then we have Children of Paradise by Camilla Gradova. Camilla she grew up in Toronto. She lives in Edinburgh now. And this is her second book and her first novel. And it's great. It's about this gang of misfits who work at a movie theater. And it's very gothic and very dark and very fun. And she's a marvelous writer. So I think I read it in a single evening. It was just so gripping. Jeffrey D. Morrison's Falling Hour. This just came out last month. And it's just a truly remarkable novel. Coach House Press. It's modernist. It's like a modernist novel. The entire book takes place in this guy's mind over the course of an afternoon. Unputdownable. I think it's one of the best Canadian books that I've read recently. Just stunning. So I recommend that for sure. And then Selma Dava's Out of It. Selma's a Palestinian British writer who I met here last fall. And this book it's set in the Gaza Strip about 10 years ago. And it's very human. It takes this very, very important political conflict that's been happening for generations, and it really gets into it. And it doesn't shy away from what's going on and the difficulties of the lives of Palestinians who are living in the Gaza Strip, but it's just so human. Like it puts you there, and it's a good story. Like she's a very good storyteller. So I would say if you can get hold of it. I don't know how available it is in Canada, but it's very much worth a read.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, they all sound fantastic. I know that the Giller Prize folks will put up something on their website with all of the information about those books, with the covers, with the publishers. So people who are watching who didn't have a pen handy while you were going through that, they can go to the website in the next couple of days and they'll be available there. Do you read all the time?
Yeah. I'm writing a book about propaganda, which I'm hoping to finish next week. So I've been reading a lot of nonfiction over the past year, but I miss fiction. Like I just am dying to get back to it.
So one of the questions, this is from Alison Timmons, is to please describe your writing process for your first novel and how the process has evolved. And I'm interested in this question partly because you have a day job and you only write in the evenings and weekends and you read all the time. So how the hell were you able to do this, to write this book?
Well, put briefly, I don't have any process I can recommend. I tend to write in sort of long, like intense jags. So I'll have like a week where I'm off from work and like I just kind of try to get as much done as possible. I mean, I hate to say it, but the pandemic was a bit of a boon. I was living in Russia when it hit, and I was working at a school, and the school closed for the summer, and there were no courses. And with the exchange rate from Canadian dollars to rubles at that time, like I didn't really have to take work for a while, so I got a lot written then. Yeah, so in between contracts, I'll get some done, but I'll write nothing for 2 months, and then I'll write 5,000 words in a weekend.
Right. How long did it take to write this novel?
Well, like I said, I started in 2017 and I finished it in the summer of 2021. So 4 years.
So, and that includes the time, that was when you were asked to write the lower registers, was it 2017?
Yeah.
And was it in your head the whole time then? Were you thinking about it all the time, even when you weren't writing it?
No. No, I
That's
mean
clear and healthy. That's a pretty healthy answer.
yeah.
So when you came back to it after a period of not having time or not being in a space to work on it, was it hard to get back into it? Like, did you know how to move back into the story, or did it take a while to find your feet again?
No, I found those gaps really helpful. In part because you come back to it, or I came back to it with an editor's eye, right? Where it's like, oh, I'm being too precious here. This metaphor is not working. Like it felt like that I would, passages that I spent hours agonizing over, all of a sudden I could come back to it and just be like, oh, this is how to fix it.
Right.
So maybe that's how I write, because it kind of allows me some distance that I need.
Right. Has that been true for the book you're writing now, the book on propaganda as well?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, nonfiction's a bit different because you kind of are building an argument and you've got your sources and you're kind of doing that kind of thing. But it's still, yeah, I find it really helpful.
Okay. Well, you mentioned Russia there, and Kathleen White is saying, you tell us about moving to the UK. Your bio mentions time in Russia. Would you care to elaborate?
Yeah, sure. So in 2017, actually, shortly after I finished the story, I met a woman named Irina, and she's Mari, which is a small ethnic group in the Volga region of Russia. And we got together, we got married a couple of years after that. And, she's got a big family, and, her culture is very important to her. So I wanted to spend some time there, getting to know her world. She knew my world really well. I didn't know her world at all. So that was kind of the impetus behind the Russia experience. And obviously, it's in the past year, it's been very difficult. It's been very difficult to see this war unfold. It's been very difficult to know what's happening to people in Ukraine. But I know that there are a lot of people in Toronto who have had to live with this in their countries, or there's conflict in a lot of parts of the world. And, this is the world we live in.
Yeah. Yeah. Monique Hendricken wants to know, do you feel the real value of art is in its transformational properties?
Yeah, I think it might be. Yeah, I think it might be. I mean, I don't know how to. I mean, I think that's naming something very real, and something very real in my life. That you put down a book, you walk away from a piece of music, and all of a sudden something's changed. I never know how to put the thing that's changed. I don't know how to name that, but I think transformation is maybe the best word.
Right.
Yeah, but now I wonder, I have to keep getting transformed. So maybe maybe it's more like an addiction. I need another hit.
Yes, right. It's the transformational property of the moment that you're in, as opposed to yourself.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it goes both ways. I don't know. I imagine that in a lot of ways I am a product of all of these bits of art that I've taken in. But maybe that's the kind of supernatural element, if I can use that word, of art, is that you kind of create these things and you encounter these things and you kind of open yourself up to the experience of being transformed.
Right.
This could have a profound impact on you. And that's maybe part of the headspace you should be in when you're encountering art. And maybe that's one of the things that the world we live in now makes very difficult, that kind of being in the transformational space, because we're constantly jumping from thing to thing. But ideally, maybe that is, and maybe that's the power of audiences, to bring that up, that when you're experiencing a piece of art, a piece of music that is profound, and you're doing it with other people, and there is that sense of you're all in it together, that transformation is even deeper.
Okay, we've got a question for both of us here, and we've got 5 minutes, so maybe this will get us out. I don't know. A question for you both: read narrative, voice, and strength of character in propelling it. Sweetland, in your novel of the same name, Michael, is single-minded and so compelling. Is there a similar character in City of Pigs? One is so concentrated on a single complicated idea that you can't look away, but you fear will fail horribly. I mean, the difference with in the City of Pigs, of course, is that it's a first-person narrator. And so really everything we get in the book comes through Alexander. And he, in my novel, Sweetland, it's a character who is single-minded in hanging on to the world that created him. Like, all he wants is to be in the place that he feels is the only place he will really be himself. And Alexander is kind of trying to escape himself in a way. Is that true?
Well, I actually really love this question, because the other thing in Sweetland, though, is that he's, spoilers, like, because he stays on the island after everyone leaves, and it's kind of a death sentence. Like, he knows that this is, he's limiting his life, and there's something, it's what made it such a, readable book, is that you kind of know that he's making this decision. And I wonder if maybe the single-mindedness, I think Alexander is single-minded, but he doesn't believe in anything, or doesn't know what he believes in. And Sweetland, in that book, like, he believes in something.
Right.
And I'd be interested in hearing you talk more about that, I guess. Like, what is it to write a character who believes in something like that?
Right. Yeah. With Sweetland, that character, he was somebody I grew up around. Like, there's a particular kind of old-time Newfoundland man who could not tell you why they think a thing. They couldn't tell you why they feel a certain way about something, but they feel it strongly, and there's no talking them past it. And I think that's why he is the way he is in the book. It's partly just pig-headedness, but it's also a sense that he has that he will not be happy anywhere else, because this is the place that made him who he is, and he won't fit anywhere else. And I wonder with Alexander, like, part of what's so compelling about him is that he is a bit of a weather vane in the book, right? And the people he encounters just kind of push him one way or the other as he hits them, until the very end of the book, when he finally takes a stand. And that was a really satisfying way to finish that book, I think, André.
Thank you. Yeah, it felt, I mean, that part I knew from early on, that at some point he's going to have to make a decision. I think that's the only way to end. If you got a weather vane, like, at some point, it's not going to be satisfying unless they.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We're 1 minute to the end here. There was one more comment I wanted to read to you. I love this book. I learned at least 10 new words. And then thanks all caps with an exclamation mark, which is a great place to finish, I think. And congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Michael. It's such a
Um,
pleasure.
Yeah, I think we have to hand it over to Daphne at this point.
What a wonderful way to end it. I love that quote. And so thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much, Andre. I know it's very late where you are, so you can get off to bed now. And thank you all for joining us this evening for this wonderful, wonderful hour. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you know anybody who by any chance missed it and would like to hear it, it will be available on our YouTube channel sometime during the next couple of days. And please don't forget to join us on April 3rd when Omar El Akid, who won for his brilliant novel, What Strange Paradise, will be interviewing Dimitri Nasrallah for his novel, which was longlisted last year, Hotline. So if you have subscribed to our book club, you'll be getting a registration notice for that. If you haven't, just head on over to our website to register, and I look forward to seeing you all then. Again, thanks, Michael, and thank you, Andre.
Thank you. Thanks, Andre.